Good afternoon and welcome to the June 13th, thank you, June 13th Council Work Session. And our first item of business is demographic data collection practices update.
Thanks, Mayor. And I'm turning to Becky.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. My name is Becky DeWitt. I'm from the City Manager's Office, and I will be here with Jen Laris Vanderhagen in just a moment. And our intent is to give you an overall update on some recent City of Eugene demographic data collection that we've done. We're going to give you some background information regarding what led to a review of our demographic data collection, as well as describe the process we use and our goals for the process, and give you some information regarding our findings. Last year, when Council passed the Ordinance for Protection of Individuals, there was an interest in understanding our organizational practices related to data collection and retention for specific demographics. To respond to that interest, we surveyed our organization to gain a general understanding of how demographic information is gathered and used in the provision of services. Each department was asked to provide examples of information they gather using the 16 categories recommended by the Mayor's Ad Hoc Committee and community members done at the time of the Ordinance for Protection of Individuals. They were asked to also clarify if we're legally required to collect that information and share the reasons for collection and how it's collected and maintained. The categories of information collected fall under two categories. Individually identifiable information, the categories outlined above, as well as political, religious, or social views, associations, or activities. Before we get into more detail regarding the information that we do collect, we thought it might be helpful to hear more information about the information that we do not collect. So the categories highlighted in black, we do not collect information regarding those categories at all. It's also important to note that for the categories that are highlighted in gray, we do collect information, but gender identity, sexual orientation, and association information is only gathered voluntarily as part of our hate and bias reporting. In general, we found that all of this information fell into three buckets, or at least one of three buckets, sometimes more than one bucket when we gather information. Certainly, there's the bucket of whether or not information is legally required under federal or state statute. There's also a bucket of service provision. We do need information in order to provide services in some of our areas. And then we also gather information in some areas to ensure that we're advancing our equity goals. These are just a few of our legally required examples. The I-9 form is completed at the initial first days of employment for all city employees. It's a federal requirement, and it does gather relatively detailed information. The form only asks for a few specific pieces of information. However, based on the documents provided, there's additional information that could be inferred. In order to have an airport, we actually do have some things that we need to do and comply with from that standpoint. An example of some of those things are their airport secured area access application. We do gather general gender, national origin, immigration status, and race information in order to complete federal criminal history checks as well as security checks for those individuals. Again, we do receive federal grants under HUD for CDBG or home-funded grant housing. This is in order to meet our requirements of reporting on beneficiaries of federal funds. In order to provide services, we do gather information in a number of areas. We thought it would be helpful to highlight some of that as well for you. Our adaptive recreation program and our recreation program in general does gather information related to disability in order to be inclusive in our services. From an adaptive recreation standpoint, the form itself only asks for gender information. However, there's a number of detailed pieces of information that are asked so that we're able to accommodate the needs of our individual patrons. As expected for EMS patient care, it's important for us to know the gender of our patients with our fire department. There's also disability information that's often gathered as part of the medical history to assist in medical treatment. Housing status information is also gathered so that fire can connect people to local service providers if needed. Our court community outreach response team gathers information to assist homeless individuals in accessing services. And again, that information regarding housing status is gathered in those areas. And potentially disability if somebody self-discloses information from that standpoint. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jen to provide some additional information.
So the next bucket that we have to highlight for you, okay,
Oh, sorry.
thank you, is a bucket that really encompasses pieces where we're working to advance our human rights and equity goals, and so we're collecting this information in order to be able to do that. The first example is that in hate and bias reporting. So the purpose of this is to assist staff in understanding the trends of hate and bias incidents. Those are non-criminal, and then hate and bias crimes. This information is voluntarily gathered, and in this process, we are identifying what the individual believes they were targeted for, right? So the identity that they share with us on their perception of why they were targeted may not actually align with their individual identity, right? So someone may believe they were targeted for being LGBTQ, even if that's not part of who they are. And so, as a result of this, information does not directly correlate each time with a person's individual demographic information. We collect this information based on state and local protected classes, which means you'll see almost all of the categories listed here that we would collect information on. And one thing we wanted to highlight is that for immigration status, that's disclosed voluntarily in this scenario and often comes out as we are talking to people, especially in the Human Rights Office, about what resources and services they may need moving forward, and they share with us more about their experience than they might in a police report. Right? And we do not keep that information in a place where it would be individually identifiable. We separate that out in our system. The city has a voluntary affirmative action plan. To administer this plan and advance our goals, we need to track specific demographic information. In this case, it's race and gender on work teams. And so this information is done to make sure that the folks that we hire who are part of our workforce are representative of the community that we serve. And then finally, the third, you're familiar with the Young Women's Fire Camp. By design and application process, this is intended for young women to increase understanding and access to fire-related professions. While a list is not necessarily kept that says all of these people are women, it would be pretty easy to infer that the participants are women. Okay, and here we also wanted to have a chance to share with you where we are collecting information that is not individually identifiable. So this category includes information that's largely anonymous and voluntary in its nature. The first piece here is the implementation of the Professional Stops program by the Eugene Police Department. This is a state-mandated program used to identify concerns and trends in law enforcement contacts. The demographics that are captured are based on the law enforcement officer's perception of a person's race, ethnicity, or gender. And this data is securely maintained in a database. No information that could be individually identifiable is collected at the time. And in providing, the next one is voluntary statistics information. So as we provide victim services, we collect voluntary demographic information to better understand the victims in our community, people who experience these crimes. And finally, for community events in the Holt Center programming, there is an anonymous survey that's put out to assess patrons in terms of who is actually accessing the programming that we have available. And the goal there is to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our community members with this programming. This slide just gives you a snapshot of what kind of data we're collecting right now. And again, because this wasn't a comprehensive study, we want to make sure you know this isn't a comprehensive table of all of the demographics that we're collecting. But you'll see that we're collecting most commonly gender, followed by disability, housing status, race, ethnicity, and then immigration status or national origin. And just want to reiterate again that information that's related to immigration status is almost always voluntary unless it's related to an employment process. And that information is oftentimes inferred and not directly associated with a person's file. So there were two key themes in this first round that we did that surfaced. The first is that most of the demographic information that we're gathering is directly related to the employment process. The second is that we're collecting information to make sure that we're providing services to our community. For example, housing status is most often gathered to verify residency. An example of how that might be utilized is we have a process for people who don't have a permanent address to access library cards and to prove their residency within our community. That would indicate that they don't have a permanent residence, but wouldn't necessarily mean that they were exclusively experiencing homelessness. And the different departments were gathering information as it related to address and inferring that that could be a way that we could the departments that were gathering address to identify where somebody lives or to be able to make a follow-up contact with them included that information in what they provided to us, assuming that you could infer someone's housing status based on that, but not that they were explicitly asking for housing status in that case. And then finally, there's disability information. Again, an example of that is the Adaptive Rec program. And then for the federal and state reporting requirements that we have. When we talked to community members to understand what their desired outcomes were, the most timely concern we heard from people was related to immigration. And so we just wanted to highlight two key points for you. The first is that from an employment perspective, information related to immigration status is collected near the final steps of an employment process with the city to verify identity. The second is as it relates to service provision, we're only collecting immigration status when it is voluntarily shared with us. And I shared with you earlier that when that comes in through the Rights Assistance Program or the hate and bias process, we don't keep that information as individually identifiable. And except for where it's required by law, we only take this information voluntarily. As a reminder, the current ordinance stipulates that we will not use city resources to identify, apprehend, or detain people whose only crime is due to their immigration status. So as for current practices, overall, we identified that individually identifiable information is gathered when legally required or otherwise necessary to provide services. Whenever possible, information provided is voluntary. This process also gave us an opportunity to assess our practices and ensure we are aligning with these goals. For example, we have one department that currently uses a database that would require gender identification or information to enter a patron into their system. And that department has decided to move away from that database and will implement a new database in 2019 that does not require that field. Our practices related to retention include aligning with federal and state requirements, ensuring information is securely stored, and that database access is controlled and secure.
Okay. From a future landscape standpoint, we do anticipate that future laws could require additional data collection and/or reporting. An example of that is the Oregon Equal Pay Act of 2017 that goes fully into effect in January of 2019, and it prohibits discrimination based on the categories outlined above. We don't anticipate that we would begin to gather any additional data from that. However, the bully rules are currently being written, and so we don't have information yet regarding what, if any, reporting requirements would come out of that. So, no matter what the future holds, we do have a commitment to ensure that as we look at our practices in this area, that we're looking at it from the lens of whether or not something is reasonably necessary in order for us to provide services and whether or not it is advancing our equity goals. So I think that's it.
Thank you very much. It was actually very helpful the way you broke that out, so I really appreciate the general themes about how information is gathered and where we might be seeing pressure points in terms of wanting to ensure that people don't feel exposed by our processes. So Mike, who else needs? Claire? Alan? Okay, take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that report, ladies, very much. At the beginning, you mentioned that we do not collect data as an organization around some of the things in the right column. That were in gray? Did I have that right? Did I hear that right? I just want to make sure, because be honest with you, I wasn't 100% sure. Very first slide, I think, or second one.
Correct.
So there we go. So the things in black you do not collect information on. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you do collect information on associations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I didn't hear in what manner, in what way, and for what purpose we do that.
So the way that the hate and bias crime information is collected and asked to be reported at the state level does ask that we gather information on bias crimes as they relate to association. And that is, in our interpretation, pretty broadly defined. So we capture whether or not someone was targeted because of their political affiliation there or their affiliation with a labor organization or a different type of organization when they report the crime.
Okay, and that's to comply with, did you say it with statute or with the state department?
I believe it's in compliance with the way that the state is gathering data related to the bias crime collection.
So through the police department?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Claire?
Thank you. I apologize for being late. So could we get a copy of this presentation? That would be super helpful. And so just piggybacking on what Councilor Clark was asking, so it sounds like in terms of the information collected around hate and bias reporting, we are collecting information on those who are reporting the crime but not necessarily tracking those things for the alleged perpetrators? Or is it both?
When somebody commits a crime, there's a process that, and I'm not an expert on what happens in that case.
I'm just talking about the reporting of it, not necessarily official charge.
Sure. So in the reporting that the city does to create the hate and bias report, we do not capture that information about the perpetrator of a crime.
Could we, as a follow-up item, it could just be in an email, could we get the pertinent local and state laws that apply to the hate and bias reporting?
Yeah.
I'd like to see those. So, I very much appreciate the update. I met with you both before this meeting, and, I expressed in that meeting it's good practice for any organization that is required to collect data to review why we do it, how we do it, how long we keep it, is it necessary? And so I think this is a very healthy review for us to be doing. I would like to find an opportunity to support the work of the Human Rights Commission. I think it was a working group that's been wanting to add some more language to our ordinance in terms of expressly prohibiting certain data collection. So I will, maybe I'll do a work session poll for a follow-up to actually bring some ordinance language for us to discuss to this body, because I think there's still opportunities for us to strengthen those protections and to provide some reassurance to members of our community that we are, only collecting data for very legitimate purposes, whether it's employment related or participation in programs that people want to participate in, and that people have confidence in how we may or may not use that data in the future. And I also want to convey the desire on the part of folks who are part of that working group that they would like to see the city manager, just in your own authority, add to the prohibition around that no city personnel shall collect or maintain any individual identifiable information regarding immigration status other than what's needed to comply with federal, state law, particularly employment. So that's a direct request that I'm making of the city manager. Thank you.
Okay. Alan?
Yeah, two questions. One, of the gray pieces of information that we do collect, a question has come up as to the security of it. There's been a lot of breaches in the news over the last couple of years. So how secure is that? Where is it maintained? And how can we assure the public that that's just not going to get hacked and
Sure.
become public information?
Some incredibly sensitive information is kept in hard copy format only. So, for example, information regarding accommodations related to disability are typically kept in hard copy format and under lock and key, and only accessible to those that would work with that information. We do have a high volume of databases throughout the city that we use, and we certainly work closely with ISD from a security standpoint, and then access to those databases is according to password protected. Sometimes information is encrypted, following HIPAA guidelines, et cetera. And so there are a number of protections in place. I don't know that we can 100% ever say that we're fully not vulnerable to that.
Everybody's vulnerable. It's whether or not we get hacked or not. Second question relates to a slide that's almost to the end, which is the equal pay law. It's not necessarily exactly on this point, but that has the potential to change the way that we do payroll. And so I want to know where we are in that process of assessing that, and if there's any preliminary indications about how that might impact our budget and changes to procedures.
Yeah, if you're okay, I think we'd want to respond to that in more of a memo form rather than just asking Becky to be off the cuff on that. But we'd be happy to do that.
But it's underway.
Yeah, we're very much engaged in seeing the impacts of this particular act, and actually are implementing it. So when we did the police chief recruitment, this was an important part of actually that entire recruitment process. And so we are implementing the act, but we'll also get the information that you asked for.
Yeah, good. That'd be great.
Any other councilors want to comment? Oh, Mike wanted a second round. Go for it.
Yeah, this is kind of an odd question, but I'm not asking about the results so much as the process when I ask. Did you do any kind of analysis on the collection of ancillary or unintentional data collection? And by that I mean, for example, if the city collected photographs of people who complained about something, whatever it was, and I took a photograph with my phone like everybody does, and I sent it to you, and you kept it. You would then have information about when I took that photo and where I took that photo and with what I took that photo. So my question is, have we looked into what kind of other ancillary data we are keeping that we may not be doing intentionally?
For the scope of this look, we really asked departments to specifically identify the information that they're intentionally collecting. We did identify a few areas, such as the I-9, for example, where, depending on the documents provided, additional information could be inferred.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So I may be a little groggy today, but I just sort of want to come back around. The reason that we asked for this was in order to really respond to a request that we expand the protections under our protection for individuals, and we wanted to make sure that we were covered. So this is sort of the first step. So I guess I'm reinforcing what Claire has just asked, which is really wanting to come back with a finer filter to say, these are the pressure points where we still think people might feel that they are exposed or vulnerable. Am I following in your thoughts? That feels to me like that's the question, and it may just be that it's here, and I just can't quite put all the pieces together in my head, but.
Yeah, I think Claire's idea of having a second work session would be helpful, because it'd be helpful for us to get a sense of what it is that people are most interested in that conversation and where you want to kind of focus some energy on that. And so and maybe that's part of it as we think about another work session, is also thinking about what are the questions and that we want to come prepared to spend more time talking about.
Right, yeah, I think that would be helpful. It's not clear enough to me if this is taking us far enough, or what our next steps really could be. I know that, part of the tension is a feeling that the state law, there's an effort to repeal that state protection, and so we want to make sure that we're doing what we can locally. So thank you. It was really a very helpful framework, so I appreciate the work. Okay, thank you.
I'm going to switch seats. I'm going to go watch my son give a presentation at school.
Oh,
so Lauren's
fun.
going to come up and.
Okay, great. And then I think we're ready for item number 2, modifications to the transfer system development charge methodology.
And Dan, am I turning this over to you to, okay, so you can get started whenever you're ready.
Get that clicker too.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Dan Kaler. Joining me today is Deb Ghilardi, and Deb has been our consultant assisting with our methodology update, as well as Eric Brown from our planning department, who'll talk about some of the incentives we're proposing. As you may recall, we were here roughly 3 months ago to give you an update as to where we are with our methodology update. At that time, we had basically these 4 topics to present to you. We talked about the reasons, there was 3 key reasons: just alignment with the goals of Envision Eugene, help support the funding for the 2035 Transportation System Plan, as well as comply with some of the recent amendments with the Oregon revised statute that pertain to the SDC methodology. And then at that meeting, Deb gave a detailed presentation on the methodology and the associated fee calculations. And at that time, I brought forward rate comparisons for similar-sized communities like Beaverton, Gresham, Springfield, and Salem. And today we'll have a broader look at that. And then lastly, Eric gave a summary of or at least an overview of the proposed incentives. So today, our thought was to summarize a lot of the discussions that we had with a variety of community groups. We had several public outreach events, and the key issues dealt with the methodology, expenditures, rates, and incentives. So today, Dell will be covering the methodology, and I'll handle our discussions with those groups on the expenditures as well as rates, and then Eric will follow up with a summary of the discussions we've had regarding incentives. In the last part of our presentation, I'll cover some of the action items. Particularly, there's 1 resolution, or 2 resolutions and 1 ordinance that we're seeking council action. Over the past 2 years, we've met with those 5 groups listed. Most we've had at least 2 meetings, and those meetings just initiated with a summary of the need, why we're updating the transportation SDC methodology, and subsequent meetings talked about the proposed options as well as the selected options. And at those meetings, we certainly heard their comments, answered their questions, and got helpful feedback with the formulation of our proposed methodology. And next, I'll have Deb summarize at least the discussion pertaining to the methodology.
So we thought we'd start with just regrounding everybody where on some of the basic methodological issues. The current or the proposed methodology is basically the same structure as you currently charge. It has 2 components. It has the improvement fee, which is designed to recover the cost of future improvements as identified in the Transportation System Plan, or TSP. And the reimbursement fee is for recovering existing available capacity elsewhere in the system, which the city then uses to fund ongoing pavement preservation projects. The fee calculation is pretty straightforward in terms of the math. It's costs, the TSDC eligible costs divided by the future growth in trips over the planning period, and we come up with a cost per trip based on both the combined reimbursement and improvement eligible costs of $134 million spread over the 41,000 projected growth in trips during the PM peak hour of the system. That comes up with a cost per trip of $32.72. Then for each individual development, that cost per trip is applied to that specific development's number of trips to determine the SDC assessment. Of course, it's pretty straightforward in the math, but the determining what the TSDC eligible costs are is probably the more complicated part of the equation. And that involves multiple steps, the first of which is to identify what other funding sources are available for the projects on the project list. And one of the key available funding mechanisms is the assessments. So the SDCs only recover the costs that the assessments are estimated not to recover. In terms of assessments can be used for the local street equivalent as well as sidewalk costs. So the SDCs aren't designed to include those. It's the capacity over the local equivalent and things like bike lanes and signals, those sorts of things. So not double dipping, just identifying which bucket of money is going to fund the different segments of these projects. And of course, any external funding, grants, those sorts of things are also excluded. The other key component to determining how much in total we're trying to recover is then taking that portion of costs, the capacity costs not funded by other funding sources, and determining what is needed for growth, because we can have capacity improvements that benefit existing development. And the SDCs only are recovering that which is related to future development. So we go through a very rigorous process that involves looking at each mode of travel. The roadway multimodal projects consider the volumes of traffic on each segment and only that which relates to the growth component of volume is the capacity portion that's included in the SDC. For the bike and pedestrian, like the multi-use paths, the standard is based on the future planned miles per capita and the population growth for in terms of the system growth. So the SDCs represent one portion of the costs, and it's, again, we go through a rigorous process to identify and whittle down what is that component of costs that we're trying to recover from the SDCs. Okay, turn it back to Dan.
Okay. The next discussion items at our public outreach events involve the expenditures. And as an overview, some of the key issues involve, the fact that we do have an annual accounting requirement for the expenditures. It's available on our city website, but we keep track of the revenue acquired and the expenditures performed during a specific calendar year. And the expenditures are forecast as part of our 6-year capital improvement plan. And another key discussion item was dealing with the definition of transportation system. We look at it as a citywide system on expenditures as well as the revenue is not broken into specific, whether it be neighborhoods, wards, school districts. It's a comprehensive citywide transportation system. And the expenditures involve 3 key categories, the first being the reimbursement fee. And as Deb had mentioned, it looks at improvements to the existing system. So typically it involves like pavement preservation projects. The other fee component is improvement, which is geared towards new construction of those capacity increasing projects in our capital improvement plan. And the third component could involve TSDC credits. And here's where a developer funds and constructs a particular project. It's a qualified public improvement project that goes beyond what is considered the standard transportation system. And they in turn, by constructing that infrastructure, get a credit towards their transportation system development charge. I'll have specific examples for each. I'll give you kind of a numerical example. The first slide here deals with the reimbursement fee component, and here's an example of a paving as well as a traffic signal improvement project on 1st and 2nd Avenue. Here the total project budget was a little over $1.4 million, and you can see that we utilized $45,000 from the reimbursement component of the TSDC. And I should mention that there was past council resolution that dealt specifically with guidelines for the reimbursement fee. In 2002, it was stated that the reimbursement fees could be devoted towards preserving and maintaining arterial and collector roads. And that resolution also had language which gave flexibility where council could also allocate or direct the reimbursement fees elsewhere in an eligible transportation system component, such as like off-street multi-use paths. These next 2 slides look at the improvement component of the transportation SDC. And here's an example of a new multi-use path with a total project budget of a little over $2 million, of which we utilized $211,000 from the improvement component of the TSDC revenue. A similar example is this connector bridge where total project budget was $1.58 million, and of that we applied $309,000 from our improvement fee fund. And this next slide here deals with the example of a qualified public improvement. Here you can see that the road constructed was of a collector road nature where it had center turn lane as well as bicycle lanes, which went above and beyond the typical local standard of a 20-foot road section. And the cost for improving this road to the collector standard was $312,000, which was in turn applied towards this developer's transportation SDC fees. Another discussion item involved the rates. And in earlier meetings, we had just similar sized communities. And I did expand it to where we got this, in this case, it's the 20 most populated cities in Oregon. And you can see at the far left, our proposed rate is that 3,272 value in that blue bar chart. Next to that is our existing rate of $2,113. And then it goes incrementally by population to the right. So you can see there is some variation between communities. And you get a feel from the bar chart height as to how we compare in relationship to the 20 most populated cities. Another component that was discussed as part of the rate structure, there is also an administrative fee, and currently the administrative fee is 9% of the system development charge with a cap of $30,000. And one consideration that we're planning to examine was if we do increase the transportation system charge, let's say by 50%, how the administrative fee would also correlate to that increase. That's something we certainly would want to seek guidance, and we could examine further on the administrative fee. There is a cap of $30,000 for admin fee, but we think that that should be kept intact. And I also provided at our public outreach events a summary of kind of, well, if we do proceed with these proposed rates, what would be an example of the charge for a variety of land uses? So you can see with single family, a single family unit has 1 peak hour trip, so basically it carries over the ratio of 1, so it's that $3,272 value. Whereas with multifamily, their PM peak hour trip rate is 0.58 trips per unit, and for like a 100 unit development, you can see it equates to that $189,000 figure. Whereas with restaurants, trips are correlated with the gross square footage. So in the case of a 1,500 square foot restaurant, that would equate to a $36,000 TSDC. My clicker is now, there we go. So the fourth discussion point involved incentives, and I'll let Eric summarize our discussions regarding incentives.
Thanks. So most of this will be just a reminder for council. We did present the incentives to a number of groups during the outreach phase, and we received feedback on them. So I'll try to summarize some of the feedback that we received as we were doing that outreach. So you'll remember that we're proposing certain incentives along with this new methodology to support our community vision. In particular, we're interested in supporting compact, complete development along our key corridors, supporting affordable housing options, and addressing climate change. 3 of the 7 pillars of Envision Eugene. Before we launch into the new incentives that we're proposing as part of this methodology, I just want to remind you again of the incentives that we do already have on the books. There is an incentive already adopted by council for transportation demand management. So developments that reduce trips to their facilities can receive a corresponding reduction in their TSDC. There is also a 10% reduction for developments within our mixed-use nodes that were identified around the city, and that predates Envision Eugene. It's thinking that was done before Envision Eugene.
Even though this isn't
one. There is also a 100% credit for redevelopment, tenant infill or redevelopment in the downtown core as well as West University. So this was done to support new businesses and that transition of businesses in those commercial areas. The thinking is that these areas sort of act as shopping centers, and when a new tenant comes in, it doesn't have a huge impact on the number of trips to that location, and therefore, to facilitate that transition, we exempt the transportation SDC at 100%. And then additionally, we have a low-income housing exemption of 100% of all SDCs in the city. So this is part of our coordinated affordable housing program that leverages federal, state, and local dollars to bring more affordable housing units to our community. The incentives that are proposed as a part of this methodology update focus on the Envision Eugene key corridors, the frequent transit network as adopted by LTD, as well as a transportation demand management bonus. And these incentives are intended to be in addition to the existing incentives that I talked about previously. So we're not proposing any changes to the incentives that I just mentioned. These would be new incentives. This is the downtown plan area where we're proposing a 30% reduction to the transportation SDC. This is the Envision Eugene key corridors where we're proposing a 15% reduction for developments that front on the corridor. And so one comment that we received was about frontage versus developments that are in the area of the key corridors. You'll see with the FTN, we're proposing a buffer. The intent of this incentive is really to create an urban mixed-use environment along the key corridor. So it's important to have frontage on the corridor as opposed to providing the incentive to the areas adjacent to the corridor. So that's the rationale behind frontage versus a buffer. Of course, changes can be made to this proposal, and it's still up for discussion. This is the frequent transit network. The 10% is associated with a quarter-mile buffer around the FTN and 5% associated with the half-mile buffer. Here it's really about access to the frequent transit network. How quickly can somebody walk to get on a bus? And so part of the conversation that we had when we were doing outreach was specifically at Planning Commission around access. So you can see here in this working map that folks on the eastern side of the Willamette River don't have ready access to that FTN unless they're close to a pedestrian bridge. So this is a working map. We started to go into detail to figure out where people would actually have a quarter or half-mile access to the FTN, but it gets complicated with various pedestrian overpasses of the railroad, as well as various physical barriers that might impede access. So if we implement this, there would have to be some discretion applied at the point of application for the incentive, taking into account the fact that there are physical barriers that would preclude that ready access. This is a summary table of all of those location-based incentives plus the transportation demand management bonus that we're proposing. You'll remember that these are meant to be cumulative to a maximum of 50% reduction of the TSDC, and developments can qualify for one of the incentives under each of the categories. So either 30 or 15% for being downtown or along a key corridor, either 10 or 5% for being within a quarter or half mile of the FTN, and then that 10% bonus for transportation demand management. The accompanying incentive is a 50% reduction for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, the dwelling units formerly known as secondary dwelling units in Eugene. And so we're proposing that there be a 50% reduction available to all developments, all ADU developments in zones where ADUs are allowed. So discussion on Monday, at Monday's council meeting precluded some areas from the ADU, from ADU development. And so this would not apply in those areas. It would apply in all other areas where ADUs are permitted. Discussion at Planning Commission, at the Housing Policy Board, and I think at other meetings with the community, talked about whether 50% was the right amount. A lot of folks called for a full 100% waiver of the TSDC for ADU development, looking to communities like Springfield and Portland where that's already the case. the proposal the proposal we're making today is still at 50%, but of course that's up to council to decide where we go with that.
So we do have 3 items for action, and we're looking at an ordinance establishing some of the amendments, mainly textual changes, that clarification, and just restating that the formal planning document is our TSDC project plan. And then there's also some additions that deal more specifically with reductions as well as adjustments. And this pertains to several sections in Chapter 7 of the City Code. And the first resolution deals with the formal adoption of the Transportation System Development Charge project plan. And this is a requirement in the Oregon Revised Statute that we have a dedicated plan which reveals the estimated cost of those projects and the timeline of the projects, as well as the percentage of the SDC revenue that's intended for those projects. And the second resolution just deals with 4 documents that specifically pertain to the methodology updates. There's some textual changes in the general methodology, as well as in Appendix A, there's some clarification to general terms and land use codes. And Appendix B is probably the greatest change, where we're having several strike-throughs of the existing methodology and replacing with text that pertains to the proposed methodology. And the Appendix F document is the rate schedule, where we're just indicating that the new transportation system development charge rate is that $3,272 figure. So going forward, we'll have a public hearing next Monday. And following that, we would have a council action meeting on July 23rd with the anticipation that the rates would be effective as of September 1st. So with that, we'll open for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I have Mike and Alan in the queue, and Claire. Okay, take it away, Mike, and Chris.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that report. I appreciate it, and for the understanding. Page 25, please. If you could hold the clock there while we're... Thank you. Did I hear you accurately to say that 50% reduction would not count in particular areas that did not call out explicitly, as opposed to the implicit ability to build ADUs in particular areas? In other words, you're saying that these new code provisions would change how we deal with that and say that you must call out SDUs explicitly in the code?
That's correct. My understanding is that the incentive would not be available to developments that are in areas where ADUs are not allowed by code.
Well, what's the difference between not allowed and called out explicitly versus allowed implicitly? That's the difference of what I'm asking you. If they're allowed to be built implicitly, are you saying that they must be called out as explicitly able to be used in order to have that apply?
I think we'll get back to you on that. This relates probably back to
It does.
the action you
It's
took
a
on
very
Monday, so we'll need to get back to you on that.
Jefferson West Side.
Page 9, please. On this. Could you give me percentages that go to each of those on page 9 and tell me which percentage are expended on each of those 3 items on page 9? How much of SDCs are on reimbursement fees versus improvement versus TSDC credit?
Well, it varies year to year. We do have an accounting report which indicates expenditures by year, by calendar year.
More or less. Can you give me a round idea? I mean, are 90% of them towards reimbursement fees, or?
I think on average it might be 75-25. You might want to clarify, Mark, but majority of the TSDC is of improvement nature, and probably less than 25 for reimbursement.
Okay, so if 75%, and this rough numbers is okay, if 75% are towards improvement fees, in other words, increased capacity, because that's what it reads, can you tell me about the projects that list for that category, how many are for increased auto capacity? Of those on the project list, how many are for, how much of that money will be expended for increased auto capacity?
Okay. So we'd have to refer to the TSP to clarify that.
So are you speaking of past expenditures or looking forward?
Let's look forward, I guess.
Yeah,
Probably
so
the easier way to go.
we'd be able to calculate that, but I don't know off the top of my head. It would be, I mean, the majority, and this is some of the discussion we had with the Chamber of Commerce, the majority of the projects in the new transportation system plan, which then became the basis for the project plan for STCs, the majority of them are alternate mode transportation, basically.
That was my
pedestrian projects.
read as well. So in other words, most of the money collected for SDCs are for capacity increasing projects, but very few, if any, of those capacity increases are for automobiles. It's for me interesting that I would think most of the general public would think when you're collecting SDCs to address capacity that they would consider that to be towards the mode of transportation that most people use, which is automobiles. And what we're finding is that very little, if any, of the increase in SDCs are for increasing capacity for automobiles. And here's why it's important to me. The increase we're suggesting here is a 50% increase in 1 year. And there's almost no increase for capacity of the type of transportation most people use. And that, I'm having some trouble with that.
So it's a bit of a hyperbole to say very little or no.
Well, that's why I was looking for numbers. If you can help me with that,
So we
that'd be
can
great.
provide the numbers, but I mean, typically the street improvement projects cost significantly more than the alternate mode projects.
Right.
But there are a significant number of street improvement projects in both the transportation system plan and the SDC
And
project.
improvement is one thing, but my point was what the rationale says up there is capacity increasing. In other words, making congestion less of a problem. So I would love if you would please tell me what percentage of the 50% increase in SDCs will go towards decreasing auto congestion. Thank you.
Okay, Claire.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought Alan was first.
Go for it, Alan.
I had a question about the ADU incentive. So that was included in which appendix? B?
The ADU incentive, which appendix is that in?
That would
Yeah,
be
Appendix B.
Appendix B. So, and we're going to take action. We're going to have a public hearing on June 18th and take action on July 23rd. So they'd go into effect September 1st. And this relates to our conversation about affordable housing and missing middle housing and the package that we're going to create. And I'm not suggesting that we wait until that is done. We've been on this track for quite a long time, so it doesn't make sense to disrupt it. And I'm totally in favor of this. So just to point out that I think we took action on May 23rd, gave ourselves 6 months, so that would put us at the end of October, so that would be after this. So we already have of a package of things for that affordable housing package. We've already got two things. We just passed the MWMC SDC waiver for small tiny houses of less than 800. And then this one would be the second one. And so I hope to see those as part of the package, but noted, implemented in it. So I'm not suggesting that we wait because I think this is important to get into play as soon as possible. And the fact that we've been working on them a long time doesn't make sense to jerk them out of the process and stick them into that one, but they're totally related. Make sense?
It does.
Okay.
All right, Claire.
Thank you. Well, I have a lot of questions. Some of them are very basic because this still seems pretty mysterious to me in some ways. So just thinking about how we calculate the SDCs and the rationale, from my understanding, is it's in part the load that a development is putting on the system. So, oh, my iPad decided to reboot on me. I might need to defer. So in terms of calculating from peak hours, other than addressing the issue of congestion, I'm not clear on the rationale because the automobile puts the same load on the system no matter what time of day it's actually using the road. So could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Both are used in the industry in terms of how we assess the SDCs. We can look at it from an average daily trips or a PM peak hour. Because the peak hour is when most of the performance standards and transportation system planning around intersections and roadway carrying capacity are evaluated, we have, both in the existing methodology and the proposed, is to assess the SDCs on that basis. So the equity is that's your contribution towards the peak. You should pay, if you have a greater contribution to the peak than, relative to the daily, you pay more under this method because you're contributing more to the need to expand capacity during that time period.
Okay. And on that note about capacity, I mean, at some point you can no longer physically expand capacity on our city streets because we're built up right up to the side. So sometimes improving capacity is doing improvements to the roadway. It is adding opportunities for alternative methods other than being in your automobile, and at some point we just can't physically create our roads to be any bigger to accommodate more vehicles on them. On the qualified public improvement, is it a one-for-one credit? The cost of putting that improvement in, is it a one-for-one credit in terms of what the developer receives?
Typically, it's a determination of the demand that the new development is placing on the system. So that's typically a condition of their approval is your development needs this much capacity. But for example, on a road or a signal, you build the whole thing rather than just the piece that's needed for that capacity. So then the developer gets a credit for the value of the additional capacity beyond what's needed for his development. So it could be anywhere from, he could be 20 to 75%.
So they get a credit of what it would have cost them in system development charges, not a credit against what they expended to actually put the infrastructure in place, the construction cost.
Well, their credit is for the value of the construction of the excess capacity.
Okay,
that credit may be more or less than their actual system development charge that they're going to pay. So if their credit's $100,000 and their SDC is going to be $150,000, then they only pay $50,000 in SDCs.
Sure, I understand that. So you showed us single-family dwellings and how those SDCs compares to other jurisdiction. What about for multifamily or commercial development? Were those comparisons not available or not pertinent, or?
Well, since it's based upon trips, it's equal in nature, or correlates equally. So if the multifamily, if the trip rate is 0.58, it's a ratio of.
And all of these jurisdictions do their restaurant calculations exactly the same?
Pretty much. Everyone uses the ITE, Institute of Transportation Engineers, trip manual, so is a standard set of trip rates. There are some differences in the type of adjustments that are applied, which generally impact only retail and restaurants, but not like a multifamily. So this is going to be generally representative of the other land uses as well, except for some of the differences in the methodology, like if you use the PM peak as the basis or daily trips. So there will be some differences.
Any idea what's happening in Tiger? Do they not want any new development, or they're just building really giant roads?
They, so in Tigard, there's both the Washington County Transportation Development Tax, which is basically an SDC countywide, plus the city assesses a local SDC, plus they overlay a particular area with another fee. So there are the potential for 3 additive development charges in Tiger.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how would the transportation demand management bonus be calculated?
So if a qualifying development sets up a TDM agreement with the city, they would automatically get that 10%.
It would be a 10% credit?
Yeah, it's a 10% credit.
I missed that.
Yeah.
And so I was confused by the new incentives proposed, because I thought you said there was already 100% credit for downtown, and now you're proposing additional credit. So can you tell me the distinction?
So the 100% credit for redevelopment or tenant infill is really for, they actually define it as shopping center uses. So it's retail uses that have a similar demand on the system. When there's an addition made to a building, so the square footage is expanded or redevelopment takes place, or it changes uses from commercial to residential or residential to commercial, the TSDC is still applied.
So you're proposing a 30% reduction then for downtown on that?
When the development or change of use triggers an SDC.
Okay. And then I had the same comment about the ADUs and the special area zones. From the language you presented, it sounds like they would not qualify for a 50% reduction on their SDCs for building that second single-family home on an existing lot that's allowed now under what we just did the other night. So I would like clarification on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Thank you. Great presentation. I'm going to focus just on the affordable housing aspects to this. You had talked before about how you could get a waiver of your single-family SDC if you qualified as a low-income project. Or an affordable housing project. Can you tell me what the cutoff is for that? What is the amount of the housing project that qualifies for the 100% waiver?
I'm not the expert on the affordable housing.
Maybe you could get back to me then. Where is that? What is the value of the home that gets the 100% waiver on the transportation SDCs?
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, I think it's if it I'm not sure that I'm understanding the question, but if it qualifies as an affordable housing development, then it receives a 100% reduction.
Okay, what are the qualifications, I guess?
Yeah, so I can look into that.
What qualifies?
Yeah.
And related to that, and you can probably get back at the same time, you also talk about multifamily housing and the costs for SDCs for multifamily housing. While we've been spending a lot of time talking about ADUs and focusing on ADUs, that is by no means the only solution to affordable housing. There's a lot of other things, one of which is multifamily housing. So I'd be curious to know, and I know some of this through being on the Housing Policy Board. When people make applications for affordable housing projects, they do receive waivers on SDCs. I'd be curious to know what is the methodology and the mechanism for providing transportation system development charge, either waivers or reductions on multifamily affordable housing projects. What's the cutoff and the methodology for that as well? Great, thank you.
Emily?
Thank you. There's going to be a lot of reductions, and so we won't have as much income from this. I think the idea is that these new buildings won't cost us more for transportation systems, because I'm not really sure why they won't cost us more. But right now we're getting this money that we're saying we're going to decrease. And if we're not using it now for increased transportation costs, what are we using it for? Are we just going to quit those things? Are we going to replace that money? And if so, Who's paying for this?
Okay, so let me see if I can, a lot of questions. So the idea is that the policy question is, do we want to incent these types of development that we identified as in the 7 pillars of Envision Eugene? And if we do, then we're going to forego some revenue that was calculated to fully implement the projects within the transportation system plan. And so then if we want to build all those projects in the transportation system plan, we'd have to come up with an alternative funding source, which could be the city share of state gas tax revenues. It could be trying to find more grant revenue, or it could be just recognizing that we're not going to be able to build everything that we had planned for in the transportation system plan.
So how will this affect the new levy? Are we basically charging more property tax to incentivize this housing?
Road bond?
Yeah,
Well, the
bond. I
the
meant.
road bond is all focused on preservation of the existing transportation system, so it's not going to affect that at all.
So we're still going to have less money from this. And we're choosing to not maintain our roads to get more housing so more people will use our roads.
Can you,
I'm just worried about the money we're going to lose and how much are we going to lose? And is it really, what's it going to come from? Now we're not going to have these improvements and we're gambling that we won't need them.
So we may have to circle back. The road bonds won't be impacted. All the projects that were approved by the road bond will still go forward.
Okay.
So that's that whole pocket of money from the road bond is a separate pocket. So these dollars will come in, and if we didn't provide the incentives, those dollars are supposed to help pay for this number of projects. If these incentives come in place and they're used heavily, it may be that we can only do this amount, and so there's this much that's the gap in the dollars. And then if we want to build these projects, we'd have to find another dollar source to do that, and that could be the gas, not the levy, but the gas tax, could be grant money, it could be general fund or whatever it could be in order to fill that gap. So there's less money coming in. The idea is that it would incentivize a type of housing that the council and the community has said that they would like to build to help on the affordable housing side. So there is a trade-off in that.
Well, I think it would be useful and helpful to know how much money we're going to sacrifice to incentivize. I want to incentivize, don't take me wrong on that, but we're asking for a sacrifice, and I want to know how much, how will we replace it, or what will we lose because of it?
So we can,
I don't think this is a freebie.
It's not a freebie, you're right. So we can try to provide sort of some estimates based on a couple scenarios of how many of these get built over time and then what kind of impact that might have on the total implementation of the transportation system plan. So we will work on providing that additional information.
Well, I do hear that we need more revenue, and as much as I want housing, this is a backward step in my mind.
I could add that we did look at, for at least for those geographic-based incentives, like the downtown area, the West University area, the nodal developments, the FTN, as well as the key corridors. So all those, so we could have some set geography. We looked at 2017 permits, so a calendar year worth of permits, and all of those permits, I guess the best case scenario would be that there would be $175,000 of TSDC fees that would have been interpreted as incentives. That's the best case, without looking at each permit individually to see if they would class or they would classify as an incentive. But if that's kind of like a worst case scenario that of those geographic-based incentives, it would involve a total of $175,000.
That's good or bad, but I'd really like some more information of what we would be giving up specifically from the plan to accommodate these reductions. So I think that's really important information before we go skipping down this road. The auto trips that we calculate for the area and how much it will be increased with this development, how does that apply to pedestrian biking and walking? Because they're not adding to the trips, but they're going to have more units, and the charge is going to be based on how big it is. I'm confused about that.
In terms of, the SDCs are assessed based on the trip rate per unit, and the unit can be dwelling units or 1,000 square feet, those types of units. So the trip rate is an auto-based trip rate. We do not have, at this point in time, a robust data set available on total person trips. So looking at bike, ped, as, you know, and auto combined for each different land use. So the industry standard is still to assess based on the auto trips and as a proxy for your estimated impact on the system. But we know that some of the trips are auto, some of the trips are bike, pedestrian. It's all put together and combined in the trip rate, both the cost per unit, per trip, as well as the trip generation rates. In the future, I think, you know, we're starting to see surveys done and counts collected on not just auto, but bike and ped, and I think in the future, we'll be in a much better standpoint to industry-wide to be able to assess and evaluate person trips as opposed to just focusing on the auto.
I think that's really important, especially in light of CRO and Vision Zero, that we want to decrease automobile use. What if I had a cooperative of people that only rode bikes or walked, but they would have to pay this SDC? So how are we incentivizing changing transportation if we're going to be unfair in this way, which seems unfair to me? I need a second round.
But quickly on that, I mean, that'd be transportation demand management tool that they would get at least a 10% credit for. So if you had a development that provided, say, a membership to bike share, for example, as part of an overall transportation demand management program, then they could get a reduction in their SDC.
And you use a different management program for each permit?
You could have a different, there's not a strict format for a transportation demand management program. It can be unique for each development, but you'd enter into an agreement with the city that would say, these are the elements of our program that we're going to implement.
I'm kind of confused.
Okay, Jennifer.
Thank you. So with what Emily was talking about, maybe I didn't understand this chart up here, but my understanding is that you are proposing to increase fees that would therefore cover these incentives that we are, theoretically, I assume, cover these incentives that we are. So we're just shifting the cost from
Who's paying that?
these things onto other. No, that is not true. Okay.
No, that's not. It's not true, and it's not allowed by statute. So it's simply lost revenue. So the idea is that you figure out what your transportation SDC is with that methodology, and then you take the incentives off the top of that. But you cannot reallocate that lost revenue to everyone else.
Okay, but we are increasing fees and adding incentives.
Right.
Okay.
But the increased fees are to pay for additional projects or that fit within the TSP, not as a subsidy to the incentive.
Not as a subsidy. Okay. My second question is for the ADUs. I'm glad Alan mentioned Metropolitan Wastewater. They are doing a one-year pilot of incentives for ADUs when the city waives them. But they are tracking, the plan is to track to see if these if ADUs are built and if they do indeed create low-income opportunities. So are we going to be tracking any of that? Is that even possible for us to see if these incentives actually create low-income housing? This one in the picture looks kind of expensive.
So as part of Envision Eugene, we're establishing the growth monitoring program.
Right.
And so we can track building permits issued for ADUs. That would be we already actually have
Right.
numbers for the past 10 years or so for ADUs. So it's a pretty simple thing to do.
Right, but are we going to be able to, yeah, I figured, I mean, we're going to know how many we have and where they are, but are we going to be able to know if they are creating a low-income opportunity or if someone's renting it out for, market rate or higher?
Right. Yeah, we could do a study. We could look at rents for ADUs, see what people are charging. Unless they're participating in the formal affordable housing program, we wouldn't be able to control the rents of ADUs.
No, yeah, I wouldn't think that we'd necessarily want to put requirements.
Yeah.
I just think that if we're doing this because we're trying to create affordable housing, if we don't track whether we're actually creating affordable housing, that seems not like closing the loop on that, but.
I think what would be interesting is, if somebody builds an ADU in Eugene and gets a metropolitan wastewater waiver of their SDCs, they also potentially would be getting the waiver or a subsidy on the transportation side. So it's the same ADU, so we could use the same data to track it, I think.
Yeah, okay.
I'd say that the other side of that is affordable housing ownership. So it's not just creating affordable housing options in the ADU itself, it's also creating an income stream for somebody who may or may not be able to make their mortgage without that
Right,
ADU.
but those are all theoretical, so unless we actually know what happens, I mean, they could all end up being, very well-off people making housing for other well-off people. I mean, there's no guarantee, and I find that somewhat difficult. Okay, my other question was, you mentioned administrative fees, and you haven't quite figured that out yet? That's what I got from your comment. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it's just open for discussion. We realize that if we do increase the fees by 50%,
Right.
at the current 9% rate, it would be certainly 50% higher. So the question was if we do, and I should mention, even though the rate is at the 3,272, that's just the maximum, that we certainly can lower the rate however deemed necessary. But whatever that landing point is, we would want to reconsider how the admin fee pertains to the final trip rate fee.
So we can
Okay,
get comments.
thank you.
Okay, second round. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. To Emily's point, today, if I build a single-family house somewhere, it's going to cost $2,000 in transportation SDCs. These proposals are to increase that by 50%, so that tomorrow, the SDC for a single-family home will be $3,000. And if it's built, though, within the area of, for example, the corridor piece with a 10% discount, that house would cost $2,700 in transportation SDCs, as opposed to the $2,000 it costs today, even with the discount. My larger point is, I think it might be wise for us to consider our appetite with regard to alternative modes that we have built into the TSP, because we are absolutely, even with the discounts, making housing less affordable in the middle of what all of us have called a housing crisis. There is no way we get around the approval of this SDC methodology that we don't significantly add to the cost of new housing of every type. Now, I think it would be wise for us, since we set the appetite list of the TSP, for us to consider that it's not a foregone conclusion that we just have to make housing more unaffordable by increasing the transportation SDCs. That is up to us. And I would suggest that in accordance with what both Alan and Chris were talking about, it would be my preference for us to incentivize and have SDCs cost less than today in real dollars, many different housing types other than just ADUs. I think there are several different types, as Alan mentioned, working their way through other bodies, and that we should consider with ours. That would incentivize from today's numbers, not tomorrow's, what we are willing to do, as Springfield has done, to make building housing more affordable for everyone at a time when we have a housing crisis. All of these decisions are ours to make, and I would prefer to see us incentivize the building of homes above the building of new bike paths. I don't mean to belittle that in the language I use there. I'm just saying those are our choices, and they're really all of ours. To say that wish list of the TSP is within our control, and the effect to implement it all with these SDCs is to make housing less affordable all around. And I think we should reconsider it. Thank you.
Okay, Alan.
It's also important to understand that the affordable housing crisis is not just in Eugene. There are 122,000 units that have to be built in the state of Oregon that we're behind on, and we have a small portion of those, about 13,000 of them. So it's everywhere. And this graph, can you go back to 14? That graph is really important to understand in that I wish you had sorted this by actual cost. That would have been a more effective graph, because what it shows is that we are 17th out of 20 in terms of lowest SDUs in the state currently, and after the proposal, we'll still be 16th in the state. So most entities actually have a higher SDU for transportation than the SDC than we do, and we'll still be in the bottom quartile even after the proposed increase. So relatively speaking, we're in good shape in terms of how it affects the building environment in the state of Oregon. Second question I had, it relates to the 50% number for the accessory dwelling units. Where and when would be a place to have a discussion whether or not that should be 75% or 100%? Would that be during the conversation we have for affordable housing package, or should we do that now before we adopt it? Yes, no question.
I think so that one of the issues with SDCs is the requirement for a methodological change, you need to do a 90-day notice prior to that public hearing for that change, and then 60 days prior to that, make that change available to the public. So what we just did on the metropolitan wastewater. So if you think you're going to do that, you want to do that, it would be easiest to do it now as part of this process, rather than coming back later, because then you're going to have to start that clock over again.
A whole nother process, which would take.
Because it's considered, when we did the wastewater one, it was considered a change in methodology. So under statute, we had to do the 90-day notice prior to a public hearing, and then 60 days prior to the public hearing, make that methodology available, which is, that's from a technical standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. It's just the time delay. Whereas you could incorporate it into, if you wanted something different than the 50%, you could incorporate it into the change, assuming that you go forward with that adoption of a new SDC.
Okay, that's very helpful, Mark. So that means that how would we encourage people to have that conversation during the public hearing, which is coming up? And then I certainly would like to have that conversation and get some more data about what that would look like and how it would work if we changed it to maybe 75 or 100% like other jurisdictions have had. How would it's already embedded in there, so people can come and talk to us at the public hearing and say, we think it should be 100. Correct? Okay. Third one, I'm assuming that our affordable housing package that we're going to come back with in 6 months, a key component of that will include metrics to determine success of the measures that we adopt. So I'm assuming that embedded in that work that you're doing, you're going to have metrics involved, like we do on almost everything. So we'll be able to tell whether or not we're doing that. I'm curious how MWMC is going to do that since they don't have any of that data. So we could find out how they intend to do that. But I was thinking that that would be part of the package that we'd come back with metrics. Fourth one, your example that about the credit. So you mentioned that if the SDC was $150,000 and they had $100,000 of cost, then they would get that reduced, and they would only pay $50,000 on their SDC. Well, what if their SDC was only $50,000 and they had $100,000 in cost? Would they get a check for $50,000?
Yes.
They would. Okay.
But that credit would stay with the property. So if they expanded in the future,
they wouldn't get cash. They would get.
Right. They'd have that credit would be on the books.
Credit for next time.
Right.
Oh, okay. So that's a little different. All right. And then the transportation demand management system that we set up is actually supposed to incentivize alternative modes of transportation. And we just approved that, like with Edison parking, where we said as part of the package, they have to come up with a TDM to work with that. Can you talk about examples of how that works and what kind of things are in that?
Yeah.
And I'll move to extend for 8 minutes.
Second.
All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Great. Okay. And you're also out of time, so we can have that question, and then if you need another round.
Yeah, if they could just answer
And
that.
Betty. Okay. Go for it.
So some examples of measures that a developer might take to reduce their TSDC would be providing bicycle facilities, showers, bus passes. Now we can provide a bike share program membership, anything that would reduce trips to the development. And then an estimate is made of how many trips would be reduced or a percentage, and then their SDC is reduced by that percentage. So it's commensurate. That's what's on the books currently. What we're proposing is a 10% bonus on top of that, just to kind of sweeten the pot for.
Even more.
Yep.
Okay. Chris.
Thank you. One of the reasons why I asked the questions about what the cutoffs were earlier was the acknowledgement that we do indeed have a housing crisis, but it's not one single housing crisis. It's in different parts. At the affordable end, it's a housing crisis as we don't have affordable housing, and we're needing to find ways to be able to build it and how the SDCs plug into that. At the other end, we can't build houses fast enough to meet the demand. That's another kind of housing crisis. And if I'm building a $302,000 house and I increase the transportation to $303,000, that's pennies on the cost of the monthly payment for that house. So I think when you look at this in terms of its impact, to me, the impact as a city person is I want to ensure that we're providing the housing stock at the affordable end. And if the SDC, transportation SDC goes up for a $400,000 house, I think it's still not going to affect the housing crisis from one standpoint, but it means we still need to continue to build all types of houses. We can't sell houses fast enough here. And how this then becomes, and this gets to Emily's question and some of the other ones, how this conversation about SDCs becomes a substitute for the larger conversation about what are our priorities. Because as Emily mentioned, we're having to make trade-offs. Do we have revenue here or do we have expense there? Do we give up something here in order to have something there? And I think that's a fair conversation, but I don't think a transportation SDC conversation is where you need to have that. We need to talk about what we're willing to trade in order to get. Is affordable housing important enough that we're willing to trade something else in order to have it? And we haven't really had that conversation. And therefore, it becomes very difficult for you to try to determine what our transportation SDC policy is, because we're trying to kind of help you understand what that is on the fly. I'm willing to have this, I'm willing to have that. We've not had a conversation about car transportation versus other kinds of transportation. How does that fit into a Climate Recovery Act? How does that fit into other things? We've not really had that one as well. So I know that puts you in a difficult spot. So what I'm saying is, I want to know where the intersection is of those things that we're talking about are important to us, what the cost of those are, and where we can try to get traction. And for me, the affordable housing conversation and the ability to, which I'm willing to give up revenue in order to have that, is really based on what is that cutoff, where beyond that cutoff, I'm losing more than I'm gaining. And below that cutoff, I'm gaining more than I'm losing. And that's why it's very important to make sure we balance the two so that I don't give up more than I want to, and I don't try to get more than I need to. And for me, the cutoff point is a real critical part of that discussion, the conversation.
Emily.
Thank you. With the ADU situation, it seems to me we, instead of incentivizing ADUs, we could incentivize any dwelling units 800 square feet or below. And that would take care of that problem. We would incentivize all small housing, which is what we want to do. Have I missed something? Are we increasing our SDCs? Well, that's a really important part to have missed, and I didn't see it in this. Is it part of this presentation? How much are we raising them?
The red bar chart compared to the blue.
You never mentioned at the beginning, we are raising these rates except for these. So I feel like I'm asking questions from the dark. I'm concerned that we haven't put together our package yet, and if we're going to raise SDCs across the board and then decrease them for some people, while we may also add a construction excise tax and other things that incentivize lower cost at the cost to the other buildings. For everybody who doesn't get a reduction but is getting a raised SDC, and then other people are getting a lowered one, how fair is that? You know, I'm not talking about $1 million houses, but, you know, we need more housing in a lot of areas. And this, I'm worried that with our other plans, we're making some housing not happen to pay for other housing. And then we lose that CET and those SDCs. So I think this is all really wrapped up together, and I'm not sure that I would support picking this up until I know how it's going to interact with the other things we do, just like I didn't support the CET saying it now but not implementing it for a year, because again, we don't know how all of this is going to interact. And I feel that I need more information, not that, you know, I necessarily don't support this, but I want to be equitable and I want to know more information. So it's complicated, but thank you.
Betty.
Thank you. We have about a minute and a half, I think. I just want to make a comment about bike and ped paths, which I think are the most important things we could spend money on. But then my question is, aren't SDCs supposed to pay for the increased cost of that house existing? And is this related if no new roads are needed shouldn't it make a big difference where the location is? If it's an extension where there are no roads now, that's big. But if it's on a street where there are already houses and it doesn't require any new roads, shouldn't that be different? Is it different?
No, we look at, I think this is the answer to your question. We look at the citywide system.
Well, those new people are going to be traveling on all the roads.
Right.
Yeah,
because
okay.
it's based upon the arterial and collector street system.
Which is back to my objection to charging people for a new road in front of their house if it's an unimproved road. A lot of unfairness in various ways. But I think this is complicated enough that we don't need to rush. I would prefer to have a public hearing and get as many comments as we can about all facets of it, and then start over again. And I don't think it's something that matters if we take 90 more days. Thank you.
been an interesting conversation, and I think part of it will be is what the council really is trying to achieve. So remember what, at the core, what this is doing is saying the council has approved a transportation system plan that included X number of transportation projects. Whether you like the projects or not, that may be a different question, but you have an approved set of transportation projects that you said, in theory, should get built between now and 2035. And one way to do that is to charge those people that have an impact or create the capacity impact on and the need for those particular plans. So the methodology is not a policy conversation itself. All it's trying to do is say, this is how you pay for those projects. And in this case, is there an interest in incentivizing certain types of projects to help those get built by reducing the transportation fee? So the increase in the transportation fee is strictly to build the projects that you've said you want built. So, and the projects you said want built in the TSP very specifically were related to the CRO. And so that, because that has CRO goals in the TSP which relate to projects. And so there has been a series of policy decisions made by the council to this point which drive this particular conversation. So I think it'll be helpful for us eventually to know if you want to have that policy conversation, and then we can revisit this based on what you choose to put in the TSP if you want to modify that at a future date. So that will just be helpful for us at one point. If we choose not to raise any of the transportation SDCs, those can't be recaptured through other developments, so the building of those projects will go to the general public, tax-paying public, through some other type of fee if we choose to build those into the future.
And just to make sure that another clarity, I mean, Alan sort of alluded to this, is we do have this broader conversation around barriers to housing. We have given ourselves 6 months. This is sort of one piece of that. Doesn't affect, is not related to the methodology questions on the SDC. It's the question of the overall impact on the cost to builders to build housing and the uses of those funds. So.
Our wish list of transportation items.
So that, I think that's an important point about the transportation needs and commitments to those, building those projects is sort of a critical fundamental decision that council's already made. So I don't want to derail that decision because we haven't quite completed our conversation about affordable housing and how we're funding it. And so
this is about growth, helping pay for
it's
itself.
right, it's about growth helping to pay for itself. So keep those two things sort of clear. Okay, I think we're out of time, and thank you all very much for a good conversation, and we're finished.